record. All right, and I will share my screen. Video. All right, and as I usually ask, hopefully my slides are showing up.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so just make it full screen there. So as you can see, so today is part 5 of the 6-week lecture. And we're kind of continuing from where we were last week. So I just want to give you guys a recap on what we did last week. So if you remember, we were looking at some of the historical hypotheses, the explanations that skeptics give to try and explain all of the facts that we learned about in week 3. And if you remember, we had a method that we were using called the criteria for inferring the best explanation. And we kind of looked at the 4 criteria. So we're looking, is the explanation plausible? In other words, is it consistent with our background knowledge? So for example, I gave the example of with the resurrection hypothesis. Relevant background evidence would be, okay, well, if God raised Jesus, it would help to know, is there evidence that God actually exists? Or, with the swoon theory, which we looked at last week, well, obviously the medical knowledge, is it medically possible to swoon on a cross or not? That would be relevant background evidence. We also looked at explanatory scope. So this looks at the quantity, right? How many of those 9 how many of the 9 facts that we learned about in week 3 can a given explanation account for? Obviously, the more facts it can account for, the better the hypothesis. Then we had explanatory power, and that's the qualitative criterion. How well does the explanation account for all 9 of the facts that we learned about? Does the hypothesis, does it appear strained, or does it take effort to make it forced to fit the evidence that we have? And then finally, we have the simplicity criterion. So the simplest hypothesis is the best, right? So we don't want, if a hypothesis employs non-evidenced assumptions, that is to be disregarded compared to the better explanation that has the least amount of those. So hopefully that makes sense and is ringing some bells from last week. And if you remember, we looked at 4 skeptical hypotheses. So we looked at the fraud 1 hypothesis, that the disciples conspired and lied and stole the body, and then they lied about the resurrection appearances. And you can see total failure on all the criteria. Then we looked at the fraud 2 hypothesis, or alternatively, the notion that maybe the women went to the wrong tomb and they got mixed up. Once again, that all failed, all 4 criteria. Then we looked at the swoon theory, that Jesus didn't die on the cross, but he got near death and then somehow revived in the tomb. Once again, all red X's, they all failed all of that criteria. And then we ended off with the legend hypothesis that, the facts surrounding Jesus and his death and resurrection aren't facts at all, but they're myths based on the dying and rising gods. And once again, all failures. So, yeah, so far the skeptics aren't doing too well. They're 0 for 4. But we're going to continue on this week and see if they can do better. So I've got another 4 skeptical hypotheses, and then finally the Christian resurrection hypothesis. So
Yes.
All right, so let's get into it. So our first hypothesis for tonight is known as the illusion hypothesis, or sometimes you'll hear it called the substitution hypothesis. So in the first place, what is an illusion? Okay, Janice. What is an illusion?
Something that you think happened.
And
That
then,
didn't happen, yeah.
is
Yeah.
it a make-believe?
So I think what you guys are describing, so you have like a false belief kind of thing. That's a delusion. You delude yourself. An illusion is something a little bit different. It has to do with misperception. So it's where you're seeing something, right? Like, pretend you're looking up in the clouds and you think you see a certain shape or something like that. Well, that's an illusion. It's not really there.
Mhm.
Same with mirages out in the desert and stuff like that. So the technical definition is that an illusion is a misperception or misinterpretation of a real sensory external stimuli, usually related to vision, but not necessarily, right? You could think you're smelling something that's not really there. That's an illusion. So in other words, it involves a real physical object that is mistaken for something else. And when we're applying that to the resurrection, there have been various illusion hypotheses that skeptics have cooked up. One of the most common is known as the substitution hypothesis. And this is extremely popular among Muslims today. A lot of Muslims go for this option based on Surah 4, Ayah 154, or something like that in the Quran, where they say that, well, look, either Jesus didn't die on the cross, and his twin, or he had a look-alike that was put up on the cross in his place, and it was Jesus's twin that actually died. Alternatively, you could say, okay, well, if Jesus did die on the cross, then okay, the resurrection appearances are explained by his twin. The disciples saw his twin, and they mistook that to being Jesus risen from the dead. So there's two ways you can play that. But with Muslims, they mostly go with the fact that Jesus, because he was a prophet of Allah, he couldn't have been killed on the cross. Instead, he was swapped out, and they think. Oh, sorry. They think that somebody else was swapped in for Jesus' place, and they appeal to the apostle Thomas, because his name is Didymus Judas Thomas, which actually means twin in Greek and Hebrew, I believe, as well. So they say, well, Thomas was actually Jesus's twin brother, and he was. Oh, go ahead.
He wasn't. No, so is that right?
It is, yeah. That's what they think, and yeah, or sometimes they'll say it was Judas Iscariot. That was his punishment. He was put up on the cross and mistaken for Jesus, or something like that. So that's what the theory is. But I'm just kind of curious. I want to throw it open to you guys before I get into my assessment. What do you guys think of the substitution hypothesis? How would you respond to someone that would go around saying this theory?
What's the theory?
They get somebody to die on the cross.
Yeah, exactly. Who would want to? Who would go along with this? Like, oh yeah, Jesus, I'll help you. Convince your disciples that you rose from the dead. I'll just go up on the cross and I'll die for you. And then, I don't think many people would agree to that.
When you think about that spear going through your side, you might go for the nails in your hand, but on your feet. But thinking about that spear that go through your side, I would like to see any man that would do that and stand up afterward and said, "Oh,
Exactly. Yeah. It's just impossible. I definitely wouldn't want to take that spear for any kind of conspiracy or something like that. Any kind of switcheroo scheme that Jesus would have or something like that. It just doesn't make sense. No human would want to go through that.
Not at all.
All right, awesome. So I want to just kind of go. Oh, and anyone else? Or are you guys good?
One.
If one day.
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
If there is a substitution, one die and one is alive.
Yeah, obviously.
So the one that died
is Jesus.
Is Jesus, and the one that's alive is what?
Yeah, so it depends on the theory. It can go both ways, but in the with the Muslims, they say that what is the illusion? It's the person, it's the that Jesus died on the cross. That's an illusion because it wasn't Jesus up on the cross. It was actually his twin brother Thomas or
Mhm.
Judas.
Right.
And then Jesus shows up and they're, oh, you rose from the dead. Oh my gosh, and stuff like that.
Mary would have a lot to say about that.
Absolutely. Great point. And that's something I'm going to be raising as well. So when we get to our kind of assessment in terms of the criteria, in terms of plausibility, it's highly implausible that a person could look like Jesus sufficiently to confuse not just random strangers, but his own family and his disciples.
Mhm.
These are people who lived with him his whole life, or in the case of the disciples, for 3 whole years,
Mhm.
living with him intimately on the road,
Mhm.
eating, sleeping, and all that together all that time. So it just seems very implausible that they wouldn't be able to, first of all, they wouldn't have known Jesus had a twin brother in the first place, and that they wouldn't have ways of being able to tell them apart. Because our background evidence, even with identical twins today,
Tell them
families
that.
are able to tell them apart, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Are you John or are you Jim Bob? I have no clue. Like, no. So our background evidence says this would be highly implausible. The people there knew Jesus and his family and that sort of thing. Also, explanatory scope. I think this theory lacks explanatory scope because there's no attempt to explain the appearance to Paul, nor even to try and explain the empty tomb, and that sort of thing. Because think about it, if there was this substitution, there would still be a dead body. Whoever Jesus' twin would still be in the tomb, right? So
Right.
yeah, that doesn't make sense unless you add another theory to try and explain these facts, which makes it ad hoc.
Maybe they thought that Jesus was a fraternal twin.
Yeah, that's what some of them try to say. Um, but yeah, even with that, like I said, you're gonna have a dead body no matter what in the tomb.
Mhm.
Okay, so explanatory power, I think it utterly fails in this regards because it posits that Jesus or his twin brother conspired together to delude the disciples into believing a false religion, right? Because
Mhm.
think about it. Let's grant the Muslim what they want to say here that, okay, Jesus's twin brother was killed on the cross. Well, then once his disciples start going around saying, "Oh, you rose from the dead," wouldn't Jesus say, "Oh, no, no, that you got it wrong, guys. That was an illusion. That wasn't me. They
Mhm.
they killed my twin brother. They got Thomas or something like that."
Mhm.
Um, and I would also say it can't explain the appearance to James. It really struggles with James because James is his biological brother.
Brother.
That's right.
So yeah, James would instantly spot an imposter and say, "Hey, you're not James. You're Thomas. I remember you," and stuff like
Mhm.
that. And same with Mary, the mother of Jesus. So
Mhm.
I think it lacks explanatory power. All right. Finally, with simplicity, I think that the theory is very ad hoc because there's zero evidence that Jesus had a twin brother. The evidence that Muslims are using for this date to the heretical Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, which are date at least 200 years after Jesus' time, right? So the sources that Muslims are using are very late, and they're known to be non-reliable because they are written by heretics. They're not representing the Orthodox first century claims. So this theory is ad hoc, totally ad hoc. Um, and I would also say there is one aspect here. There's a bonus criterion, illumination. So this is the criterion where if a certain theory is true, it can illuminate or explain other facts outside of the 9 historical facts that we proved in this in week 3 of this series. And on the bonus criterion of illumination, I do think there is a positive point to this hypothesis. And that's the fact that, well, the Gospels sometimes portray Jesus as being unrecognizable. So, Mary Magdalene
Mhm.
mistook Jesus for the gardener. Also, the story of the Emmaus disciples, they were supernaturally prevented from recognizing Jesus. So a Muslim might try to say, well, we'll see this data. If this is a historical fact, why can't they recognize them? Maybe it's because, there was a switcheroo or something like that. And it wasn't actually Jesus they were seeing or something like that. So I think it does pass the criterion of illumination, but just remember there are equally probable explanations for this that don't posit a twin brother of Jesus or something like that. No, we know that Mary Magdalene was probably crying and upset, and so her vision was obscured. And what she probably didn't have a good look at who she was talking to. And with the Emmaus disciples, the Gospels tell us that there was a supernatural thing causing them not to recognize Jesus as he walked with them. Exactly. So that there are alternative explanations, right? You don't have to go with, it must have been some twin or some lookalike that they didn't recognize. Yeah. So
he was in his resurrection body in both cases.
that's another good point. He was in his resurrection body. So he had a new glorified body and stuff like that, right? So, all right. So I just want to play a 4-minute video clip, kind of just giving an assessment of this theory. So is that showing up? The video?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why it really
The resurrection of Jesus Christ is pivotal to the Christian faith. Without the resurrection, Jesus was a phenomenal teacher who lied about being God and was sentenced to an textual. Critics tend to focus a lot of energy on refuting the claim that Jesus physically rose from the dead. One of their theories is called the substitution theory. This theory states that the person who was crucified and died on the cross was not Jesus Christ of Nazareth, but someone impersonating him. There are two prevailing thoughts. Either it was Jesus' twin brother, or it was someone transfigured to appear physically like him. The reason so many people claimed to see Jesus Christ after he was miraculously resurrected from the dead was because he hadn't actually died. However, there are several problems with this theory. Let's take a look. Firstly, Jesus had no twin brother. There is zero evidence for this in authenticated ancient texts, neither by Christian nor non-Christian writers. Secondly, the case of mistaken identity where someone was transformed into the likeness of Jesus also has no ancient textual support. The few scholars who believe this to be a more probable explanation of the resurrection of Christ claim that it could have been either Thomas the Apostle, Judas Iscariot, or Simon of Cyrene. Which one of these people do you think would have endured the unimaginable agony of crucifixion until the point of death, without caving in and confessing to the deception? Thirdly, this theory calls into question the intelligence and due diligence of the Romans and the Jewish authorities. They would have been keeping a very close eye on him. Can one believe that the Jewish authorities would make such a mistake? They wanted Jesus dead, and after being found guilty at trial, the Romans had a legal obligation to carry out the sentence with severe consequences for anyone who bungled it. Fourthly, Mary, the mother of Jesus, would hardly be found spending 6 hours at the foot of the cross where her son was slowly dying, mourning his suffering and imminent death, if she knew this man was not her son. Fifthly, why would Jesus disappear when his followers were being persecuted, tortured, and executed for proclaiming his death and resurrection as proof of his divinity? Abandoning them does not fit with his nature at all, and after such an abandonment, would his disciples not easily have recanted their belief in Jesus as being God incarnate on earth, in order to avoid being tortured to death? Lastly, who would have had the ability to miraculously alter the appearance of a man to look so much like Jesus that his mother and some of his closest friends would have been fooled? It also raises more questions. If this person, or being, performed this miracle to deceive people, what had been their motivation? Also, how do people believe the word of someone who openly admits to having deceived an entire community, on purpose? If true, then this deception led to billions of people believing a lie, having an entire religion based on it. Without textual evidence from ancient authors from the 1st or even 2nd century, such an important, faith-altering incident has no leg to stand on. In addition, when trying to apply logic to this theory, too many questions remain unanswered. The substitution or mistaken identity theory is not a viable, feasible, or even logical alternative to the miraculous resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have a video series covering 5 other alternatives.
All right. So I think you guys get that in terms of the video clip, but
Mhm.
the video raises a lot of the points, the great points you guys were raising, right? About the family being able to spot an imposter right away. What motivation would they have to go along with this? And it raises the moral issues of, well, Jesus would be a false prophet then. According to Islam, Jesus is a prophet. But if
Mhm.
he allowed the disciples to fall for this trick that thinking Jesus rose from the dead based on an illusion,
Mhm.
that would make Jesus a false prophet and an immoral. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So is everyone good with the illusion hypothesis?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome. So let's move on to the second skeptical hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis. And I think this is the most popular natural explanation for Jesus's resurrection that skeptics give today, right? So, in terms of hallucinations, they're different from illusions and delusions. Basically, hallucinations are wholly subjective in nature. So, they involve, quote unquote, false perceptions of sights, sounds, touches, or smells for which there's no external referent. There's nothing there. It's literally all in your head. So that's different from an illusion where there is something out there in the real world. There is a cloud out there that you're mistaking for something else. With hallucinations, there's nothing in the real world. It's all literally in your head and you're imagining it. So the hallucination hypothesis posits that the disciples, after discovering the empty tomb, began having grief-induced hallucinations, both individually and collectively in groups. And because of this, they came to believe that, oh, Jesus must have risen from the dead. These are the resurrection appearances. And on that basis, they believed in and taught in Jesus's resurrection. In addition, they say that the Apostle Paul had some kind of hallucinatory experience on his end, based on having cognitive dissonance. So they say that he felt bad because he was persecuting and killing so many Christians that this caused inner turmoil and induced a hallucination in him. So yeah, in terms of our assessment then, how would we assess this hypothesis? Well, are hallucinations a plausible hypothesis? No, they're not. So think about it. Remember our 9 historical facts that we proved in week 3? There are various group appearances, right? He appears to 500. He appears to the 12 disciples at once, or the 11, technically, because Judas is dead. Oh, go ahead. And
The
to
road
the
to Emmaus, he too.
oh, sorry, go ahead. What'd you say?
When he walked on the road to Emmaus with his other two disciples.
Yes, yeah, there was 2 at once there. So the problem with this is that hallucinations are implausible to explain group hallucinations because hallucinations by definition are private affairs. I can't share in somebody else's hallucination simultaneously. It's like a dream, right? Like imagine saying to your wife or your husband, like, oh, I'm having this great dream. Come and join me in my dream. You can't do that. You can't share the same dream or the same hallucination. But yet we have these collective hallucinations where they're all seeing the same thing at the same time. That doesn't fit what we know psychologically from about hallucinations and how they work. Secondly, it's very implausible that all 11 of the disciples would have been primed to have a hallucination because they don't fit the psychological profile. Psychologists have identified certain conditions that make people prone to hallucinations, right? Mental illness being one such factor. The disciples don't fit that category. They were not people that were prone to hallucinations based on what we know of their backgrounds. In terms of explanatory scope, I would say that this theory doesn't even attempt to explain the empty tomb. It just assumes it. And I would say I don't think it really explains Paul's appearance as a skeptic because he was not psychologically predisposed to have a hallucination of Jesus either. Think about it. they're saying, well, Paul was in this state because he felt guilty about killing and persecuting Christians. But that's not what Paul himself tells us. If we read his own autobiography in Galatians, he's proud of it. No, I'm zealous. I love that I'm killing these Christians because they're traitors. They're betraying God. They're preaching a false Messiah. Paul tells us he was zealous for the traditions of the Pharisees and for what he was doing. He was proud of it. So I think it lacks explanatory scope there. It doesn't account for what we know from Paul's own writings. In terms of explanatory power, like I said, the evidence we have shows that the disciples were not in a situation conducive to have hallucinations. They didn't fit the psychological profile. And also there wouldn't have been, So typically only 1 to 3% of the population experience hallucinations. So hallucinations are extremely rare, even among regular people today. And this becomes even rarer when we're talking about what are called multimodal hallucinations. So multimodal, if you posit, well, Jesus, they didn't just see Jesus, they touched him, right? There were multiple senses were involved. They ate, maybe they smelled him as well. So they heard him, he spoke. So these are what psychologists call multimodal hallucinations. And those are even rarer to have, let alone having 11 people at once all having multimodal hallucinations. It doesn't make sense at all. And you have people, different genders, different temperaments, different mindsets. It just doesn't work. What's another thing? Remember our 9th fact as well, is that these resurrection appearances resulted in the transformation of the disciples. Their lives were totally transformed in their sincere belief that Jesus had risen from the dead. And hallucinations don't have long-lasting effects. We've studied them medically. They don't result in transformed lives, and that sort of thing. So that's totally antithetical to what we see with the gospel data. And further, they wouldn't have claimed to have seen Jesus resurrected in a mundane form. So another thing about hallucinations that we've proven medically is that they have to be consistent with our prior expectations, right? What we've been trained socially, what we've been trained in our culture, and all of that determine what the content of the hallucinations we see. But so what did the Jews of the first century, their expectation would be to see a glorious resurrected Messiah. The resurrection would be, he would be in a white robe. It would be glowing. Maybe he would be coming down in the clouds of heaven like the Son of Man. This is what ancient Jews expected the resurrection to look like. But instead, they're seeing Jesus just in a mundane, ordinary Tom, Dick, and Harry. He's even still got his wounds and all that stuff. So this is
Christ.
It's totally against the expectations. So this doesn't look like a hallucination at all. And finally, I would say it's totally ad hoc, where they make up ad hoc assumptions, such as just making up Paul's mindset and pretending that he was conflicted about what he was doing. So I just want to play a short clip of Mike Licona reinforcing this on the hallucinations here. All right, so.
Right behind me is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is what most scholars believe is the actual burial tomb of Jesus. They prefer this over the garden tomb for a number of reasons. I don't want to talk about those, though. What I want to talk about is why we should believe Jesus rose from the dead rather than hallucinations. Now, the hallucination hypothesis was most popular maybe 100 years ago, but then it was soundly refuted. Interestingly, it is the most common objection that is offered by skeptical scholars today. But it is a horrible explanation, historically speaking, for a number of reasons. Number one, when we understand hallucinations, there are various modes, like you can hear something that isn't really there, see something that isn't really there, feel something that isn't really there. There are like 6 or 7 different modes in which someone can experience a hallucination. Studies done over the past century, multiple studies on hallucinations, reveal that on average about 50% of senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one experience a hallucination of some sort. Only 7% experience a visual hallucination, and senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one appear to be the category of people that are most likely to experience a hallucination. So even at that 7%, only 7% experience a visual hallucination of their loved one. Now, you think about the disciples, all the reports we have say that all of them experienced an appearance of Jesus. So an appearance meaning a visual experience. So that's 100%. It's an unthinkable 100% rather than the mere 7%. So that's one problem with the hallucination hypothesis. The percentage of recipients is way too high. Second, in the earliest Christian accounts, for example, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, we have 3 individual appearances of Jesus, or appearances of Jesus to individuals, and 3 to groups, to the 12, to more than 500, to all the apostles. And we have group appearances within the Gospels as well. But what we understand about hallucinations is they are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external reference. So if someone is hallucinating, let's say, they're like dreams. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having this dream, I'm in Hawaii. Go back to sleep, join me in my dream, and let's have a free vacation. You can't do that. And it's the same thing with a hallucination. You cannot have someone join in your hallucination because there's nothing externally going on. It's only in the brain of an individual. And yet we have no less than 3 group appearances mentioned in the earliest Christian reports. And thirdly, hallucinations don't account for the appearance to Paul. Paul wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. He was glad that Jesus had been executed, and Jesus would have been the last person in the world that Paul would have expected or wanted to see. And yet he experienced what he thought was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And then I can also say that if the tomb was actually empty, hallucinations wouldn't account for how the tomb became empty. So these are just a number of reasons why the hallucination hypothesis makes a horrible hypothesis in terms of its historical value.
All right. So yeah, hopefully that explains, why so many scholars today think the hallucination hypothesis just sort of fails. But yeah, any questions or comments about hallucinations before I move on?
Oh gosh.
Is it a symptom of mental disorder?
It is.
The hallucinations, yeah, mental disorder. So mental disorder is by far the explanation that explains most people that hallucinate. But hallucinations do occur in normal people as well, but it's just extremely rare kind of thing, like only 1 to 3% of people who aren't predisposed to that experience hallucination and stuff like that.
Can you hallucinate while awake?
Say that again.
Can you hallucinate while you are awake?
Of course, yeah. That's when all the hallucinations do take place, is when you are awake and stuff like that. Yeah.
But you could.
Some medication too you get.
Yeah.
Some medication you get could cause
You can hallucinate, yeah.
Yep.
Gotcha. Yeah. Awesome. So yeah, the hallucination thing doesn't work. And we know that based on modern psychology and stuff like that. So that's a failure right there. So I want to move on to the next hypothesis. And this one's sort of related, but there is a difference here. So this is called the objective vision hypothesis that skeptics will give. So it's kind of like a hallucination, but instead of being subjective, they'll say it's an objective vision. So meaning there's something real that you're witnessing, and it's a paranormal or a supernatural event, right? So look, even as Christians, we know the Bible tells us God sometimes sends objective visions to people and stuff like that. So what the skeptic here is saying that, yeah, there is a supernatural event related to Jesus, but it wasn't that he rose bodily from the dead. It's that the disciples had an objective vision of Jesus, and they mistakenly thought that meant he rose from the dead. And in terms of examples of objective visions, there are many different types. So these range from, indigenous vision quests. Native Americans engage in things called vision quests. We have the biblical reports of visions and stuff like that in the Old and New Testament. Some people talk about, Roman Catholics talk about Marian apparitions. That's a form, if true, which I don't think it is, but if true, that's a claim of an objective vision. They're saying Mary's actually appearing to people. And also, there are things called post-death communications in the literature. That's a fancy way of saying basically ghosts of dead loved ones. And this is important because, as we said, most normal people that experience a hallucination or something like that, it can be induced by grief. If you're grieving the loss of someone, which the disciples would have been, right? They just had Jesus killed on the cross, so they would have been in a state of grieving. And that's when these post-death communications seem to show up. So could it be that maybe Jesus appeared to them as a ghost or something like that? So I'm just going to play a clip, again, just to distinguish between an objective vision and a subjective hallucination, just again to make it clear the distinction there. Okay.
An apparition, broadly defined, is the appearance of a spirit being. An apparition can appear in space-time or outside of it, such as in a dream or vision. An apparition can be ethereal, immaterial, ghost-like, or on very rare occasions, it could even be physical, something that can be touched. I think that most apparitions are hallucinations. However, an apparition is likely an objective reality when three qualities are involved. Number one, the percipient is a group. Since hallucinations are extremely rare, if not impossible, for an apparition to appear to a group that simultaneously sees this apparition is likely not a hallucination. Second, the percipient lacks grief, religious belief, or belief in an afterlife. And third, the apparition imparts accurate information to the percipient who could not have known this information otherwise. Now, it's interesting to observe that when it comes to the appearances of Jesus, Jesus appeared to groups. Jesus appeared to Paul, who lacked grief over his death and who lacked belief in the Jesus movement. So even if we want to call the appearance of Jesus apparitions, these are not hallucinations. They would be objective reality.
Okay, so that's again just kind of distinguishing what the theory would be here as to what the skeptic's saying here. They're saying Jesus was there. There was a supernatural event, but it's just Jesus was a ghost. He wasn't risen bodily from the dead. So I'm just kind of curious. As you heard from Mike Lacona, this takes care of the issue with the group appearances, because objective visions can be seen by groups of people and stuff like that. So how would you guys respond to a skeptic who's advancing this kind of supernatural skeptical theory?
I would think they're not in their right mind of thinking.
Right. So you think it would just be in their head?
Because with so much knowledge, how can they be skeptical about it? Something is wrong with them mentally.
Okay. Just to push back, if you don't mind, would you say the same about Stephen? Because Stephen had a vision of Jesus, right? Was there something, was that just in his head, or do you think that was an actual vision from God?
That was actual.
Before it happened.
It
Yeah.
could have happened. We don't know. It could have happened.
But it did happen to Stephen. He died.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Yeah. And anybody else on how you might respond to a skeptic who advances this?
Go read the word. Go read his Bible.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
just-
right. Yes.
But the Old Testament spoke about his death. The
Yeah,
New Testament.
thank you, Sister Janice. Tell him to read Isaiah.
Thank you.
Awesome. So yeah, so look at the context of the Old Testament, where it's clear, right? We saw in week 1 that the Jews all believed in a bodily resurrection. There wasn't it wasn't just ghost or some kind of apparition. So okay, so here's my answer in terms of our four criteria. So is this objective vision, is Jesus just a post-death ghost or communication? Well, I think that's highly implausible. It's implausible that God would send all the women, Paul and James, and the disciples, objective visions, which would fool them into believing Jesus rose bodily from the dead when he hadn't. Because again, that bodily resurrection would have been their natural assumption given their cultural background and the Old Testament, which clearly taught a bodily resurrection from the dead, right? So if he did do this, if God sent Jesus back as a ghost, tricking the disciples into believing in the resurrection, that would make God a deceiver. And that's
right.
That's implausible. God is more.
Yeah.
And he's not a deceiver. My God is not a deceiver.
No, not at
He's
all.
not a liar. He will not lie. My God will not lie.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that makes this theory very implausible based on the background knowledge. And even if the tomb, think about it this way, even if the tomb were found to be empty for some other reason, right? Because obviously God sending Jesus back as a ghost, well, the body would still be there, right? So even if you try to explain the empty tomb away on top of that, I would say this would only compound the issue of God's deceptiveness, because God allowed the tomb to be empty and sent Jesus back as it goes. So it makes it even worse. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Explanatory scope, we already covered it. It doesn't even attempt to explain the empty tomb. Why was the body missing? We see ghosts in all examples of post-death communications or ghosts. The bodies are still in the grave and stuff like that. So why is that tomb empty? And it doesn't explain Paul's appearance either. Why would God send Paul, Jesus' ghost? And even if Paul saw a ghost, he was a zealous Pharisee. The Pharisees believed in life after death. That wouldn't be enough to convert him into believing, Jesus is the Messiah or something. He would just say, get out of here, spirit. I don't want anything to do with you. Go back to Hades or hell or Sheol.
Where we come from.
Exactly. In terms of explanatory power, look, I think it lacks explanatory power because the New Testament, as we learned in week 1, clearly says Jesus had a bodily resurrection appearance.
Amen.
And the New Testament specifically mentions visions versus appearances. They're different according to the New Testament. So lots of Christians had visions, right? But resurrection appearances were limited in time, Paul's being the latest, about a couple of years after Jesus' ascension. And that was the last one. According to the New Testament, after Paul, Jesus never appeared to anybody again. He showed up in visions, but only appearances. And that was the criteria for being an apostle, right? That's why Paul was an apostle, because he had a resurrection appearance, right? And he contrasts this with later visions that he has, right? In Corinthians, he mentions visions that he had after that. So that, I think it lacks explanatory power because you're ignoring the New Testament data, which clearly says resurrection appearances are different than visions. They're not the same thing.
No.
And also, objective visions typically entail a heightened sense of perception or what people call an altered state of consciousness. Whereas, again, the resurrection appearance narratives are very mundane. They're seeing Jesus on earth. He's not glowing. He's an ordinary person. And that's counter to the experience of objective visions of this sort. So that's it for my kind of critique there. Any in terms of simplicity, I don't think it really has any ad hoc components of mention. But yeah, I'll just turn it to you guys. Is there any questions or comments about this objective visions theory, or does that make sense? Yep. Okay. All right. So last but not least, let's give the resurrection skeptics one last attempt. And this time, this is a theory advanced by Buddhists. Typically, it's the rainbow body hypothesis. So you guys were looking forward to this one. Essentially, the rainbow body hypothesis essentially says Jesus never rose from the dead. Instead, he became enlightened like the Buddha, and ascended to a higher level, and leaving behind a rainbow body. So basically, that's where the body shrivels up and disappears and becomes leaves behind a rainbow light as he ascends to a higher plane, just as Tibetan Buddhism teaches. And believe it or not, this was actually applied to Jesus' resurrection by a biblical scholar called Dr. Dale Allison. So he's somebody who argues that maybe Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Instead, he got a rainbow body. So I just want to play a clip of him explaining this theory that he has about Jesus. Okay, here he is.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So now come to you have a chapter titled Rainbow Body. And I found that chapter quite interesting. And in fact, this is the part of the book that made me uneasy. I guess you could say theologically uneasy. And, I'm looking at, I was unfamiliar with rainbow bodies before this. And wow, looking at what you cover in there, there's some really interesting data to which you appeal. I don't know what to do with it, to be honest with you. But let's talk about rainbow bodies here. Yeah, go ahead and tell us, what are rainbow bodies?
Okay, so I didn't know anything about this until a few years ago myself. But this is a tradition within Tibetan Buddhism. And according to this tradition, certain advanced Buddhist masters, upon dying, achieve rainbow body. And what that means is that their bodies shrink out of existence within a few days of their death. Some of these traditions say that, some hair and fingernails were left. That's all. Weirdly enough, very weirdly enough, there are also people who sort of shrink halfway and stop. And by the way, I'm like you, Mike. I really don't have any idea what to make of this stuff. But there are pictures online of some Buddhist masters who are dead, and they look like they've shrunk, and they're in their clothes, and their clothes are way bigger than they are. I don't know. I don't have any idea what to do with this. But
honey, I shrunk the priest.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in Tibetan Buddhism, this is a part of leaving the world, or can be part of leaving the world, and it's called rainbow body because rainbows are supposedly seen around the sites where this happens. Now, it turns out that these stories are very old. There are lots of them, but this is an ongoing tradition, and that interests me especially. So two of them took place within the last 25 years, allegedly. A Roman Catholic priest who's a Tibetan scholar was able to go to Tibet, talk to some people, interview people on the scene for one of these. Read a biography that was written within a year or two of one of these fellows passing. The Dalai Lama, in an interview, was familiar with the other case, seems to accept it as actually happening, which is really interesting. If you read the Dalai Lama, he's skeptical about some things, skeptical about some miracles, uncommitted to others. He hangs out with scientists, who study Buddhist meditation and all that. He's not a naive, uninformed person, and he thinks this happened.
Okay, so I think that kind of tells you, again, what this theory is, kind of thing. So, yeah, I can hear you guys kind of chuckling there. So, let's say a skeptic actually takes this seriously, and they believe, yeah, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. He attained a rainbow body. How might you guys respond to a skeptic who thinks that?
Mad.
I think something is wrong.
Where are his nails and toes or whatever, that he's supposed to leave behind?
Well, Jesus of himself told you when he comes back, you will see him as he is. He never said anything about rainbow body or even a different body. He's going just as you see him before you're going to know him. We shall know him.
Absolutely, yeah.
I cannot understand it. What's wrong with these people when they have so much knowledge about resurrection and the Bible and all, and they can hold on to these silly things? Something is wrong mentally with them, and they don't want to accept what's the truth and holding on to all this. How could you expect a body to just trim like a rainbow? Tell them to go and do some medicine. If they went and did some medicine, they'll have a little bit more a better idea.
Hallucination. Don't forget, Satan has blinded the eyes of mankind.
Yes, I know, but you mean they said they allow Satan to blind the eyes so much that they hold on?
That's right. That's why a lot of people don't accept Christ, because
they know
the truth, and instead of taking the truth, they rather believe the lie.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Great.
I can't understand it.
You don't want to understand it, girl. You serve your Lord.
Awesome. Yeah, no, great and valid thoughts and stuff like that, right? So it's going to get even worse from the rainbow body hypothesis. So let's get into the assessment here, right? So in terms of the plausibility, so I don't know if I can move. So here's an example of the supposed example of the rainbow body. So it looks like the monks shrunk into the size of a baby and is on their way to becoming rainbow light, right? So that's the supposed evidence. But so in terms of the plausibility, look, it's highly implausible that Buddhism is true. Number one, because on the background evidence, Buddhism fundamentally is an atheistic religion. Mm-hmm. And I would say we have amazing evidence that God exists. So there, it's game over for this rainbow body, because the religion that teaches this doctrine is false because it's atheistic. But likewise, it's also implausible based on the historical background evidence too, because Jesus was Jesus was not familiar with Buddhist teachings. The teaching on the rainbow body, it didn't even exist in Jesus' day. Historically, this thing didn't come around as a teaching until the 7th or 9th century AD. 900 years after Jesus is the first time people started talking about rainbow bodies. So I just think it's highly implausible to attribute this to Jesus. And again, God would not use a rainbow body phenomena in the first century Jewish context, because once again, he would know that the ancient Jews would interpret this as a bodily resurrection, and therefore that would make God a deceiver. It's the same problem with the objective vision thing here. It would make God a trickster of sorts. In terms of explanatory scope, the theory can explain the empty tomb because the body shrinks away, although in some cases, as somebody mentioned, well, sometimes hair and nails are left behind. So didn't they see Jesus's nails and stuff like that? So yeah, sometimes there are some remnants still there, and that wasn't found in Jesus' case. And think about it too, the empty tomb, the cloths were folded up neatly to the side when Peter and John looked in. Well, the rainbow body wouldn't do that because the body just shrivels up and then bursts out as rainbow light. Well, that wouldn't cause the shroud to be folded neatly and put to the side. Also, I would say in terms of explanatory scope, this theory can't explain the resurrection appearances because no one was in the tomb to see Jesus ascend into the rainbow light, right? The tomb was just the dead body on the Sunday before the women came there. So nobody would have witnessed the rainbow light anyways. And there would be no resurrection appearances because Jesus ascended to the higher plane. So what explains the appearances? Did he come back from ascension? That contradicts Buddhist teaching, right? Once they ascend or they become enlightened, they don't come back, and only the Buddha does that. So I would say, it doesn't explain the resurrection appearances at all, let alone the fact that the disciples totally transformed by the appearance experiences they had. It also lacks explanatory power because it conflates Jesus' ascension with his resurrection, which are two separate events kind of thing in the Bible, right? And it doesn't explain the fact that the Jews believed in a bodily resurrection. We clearly established that in week 1. Furthermore, rainbow bodies, according to the doctrine, Buddhists say it takes 7 days for the body to ascend. But Jesus rose within
3 days in the grave.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't even 3 full days. It wasn't 7
Exactly. That's not even 3 full days.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And under the Jewish thing, I think it takes 4 days before the body starts to decay. If you remember, so with Lazarus.
Yeah, exactly. Great point. So this totally contradicts, right, their doctrine. But what's more, I'm going to play a clip in a second from Dr. Lydia McGrew. When it comes to the evidence, you heard Dale Allison pretending like, oh, we have this great evidence. Even the Dalai Lama is convinced. The evidence is horrible. And I'm going to play a clip showing that. But before I do that, on simplicity, once again, this entire theory is ad hoc. There's zero evidence supporting the rainbow body phenomena in general, let alone that that's what happened to Jesus himself. And all the evidence we actually have contradicts this notion. So with that said, let me just play a clip. What is the quality of the evidence that Buddhists give for the rainbow body? Was it frozen? Okay, so this is a Christian apologist, Dr. Lydia McGrew. Okay,
So let me talk a little bit about how they're not comparable or similar. How difficult in the things that he quotes and cites as evidence would it be to be mistaken? And for some of the people whose accounts we have to just be mistaken. Now, it might be that somebody else is carrying out a fraud, but in that case, we don't know who they are or whether anybody knew who they were and whether they got in any trouble for it or whatever. And for many rainbow body claims and for many of the people, not that hard. He has this very strange quotation concerning the Dalai Lama, who believes that someone achieved rainbow body. He is the Dalai Lama. He furthermore knows firsthand some of the witnesses involved, witnesses who handed him physical evidence related to the alleged event. You want to know what the physical evidence is? A piece of a robe. Okay, so the Dalai Lama talked to a couple disciples of one of the Buddhists who supposedly achieved rainbow body. They appear not to have gotten into trouble for doing this, and they meet the Dalai Lama and they say, yeah, our master achieved rainbow body, and they hand him a piece of cloth. This is a joke. This is like a bad epistemological joke. If I said that my husband flew around the house yesterday and I handed you a shoe and I said, and this was the shoe he was wearing, that shoe proves nothing. That's not physical evidence related to the event. What are you talking about? It's a piece of cloth. It could be from somebody's robe. It could even be from that master's robe. That is no evidential vector at all to support their claim beyond the claim itself. Ridiculous. They handed him physical evidence related to the alleged event. I mean, if the Dalai Lama thought, wow, ooh, you handed me a piece of his robe, then, Allison has this other talk about how the Dalai Lama is incredulous. Well, if he thought the piece of the robe was epistemologically relevant, that's pretty darned credulous. All right. Or there was one case where they were coming in every day after the person died, and there was this robe covering his body completely to begin with. And then people would come in, and they believed that it looked like the object under the robe, which was presumed, Allison says, to be the body, was getting smaller each day. And the object's under the robe. We don't know what they're presuming to be the body. This reminds me of the origins of Mormonism, where Joseph Smith wouldn't let the other so-called witnesses even see the alleged golden plates. He said he'd been told he'd be killed if he showed them. So he had these metal plates of some kind wrapped up in his tunic. And they said they saw them with the eyes of the spirit. So it's like object under a robe. Okay. Or to come in and say that the body was gone later. So they would open the room after 7 days and the body was gone. Okay, so maybe the body was gone. But to be mistaken about whether it turned into a rainbow, that's very easy. And that I mentioned, appearance, experiences, whatever the...
And I think there's another 41. Oh, let me just see. 4152. So as you can see, the evidence, so-called evidence for these rainbow bodies is very poor compared to what we have with the resurrection, stuff like that. For example, the Dalai Lama, they claim, this priest turned into a rainbow body. And well, what's your proof? And they hand him a piece of his robe. This is the robe he was wearing when it happened. But the robe doesn't say anything about whether he turned into a rainbow or not. So it's the evidence is very poor. And another thing with sorry. Okay. Another thing with the evidence is that these Tibetan Buddhists are very esoteric. So when so Dale Allison, he tried to probe to get better evidence or to interview the witnesses. And they won't even talk to you. They'll say, the evidence is only for the enlightened. We can't talk to you or share it with you unless you're one of our clan who already believes our beliefs and stuff like that. So just the evidence compared to what we have with Jesus and the resurrection appearances, it's night and day. And don't forget that there's also the possibility of outright fraud. Maybe these Buddhists are just lying because do we have any proof that they're sincere in their belief? We can prove that the disciples were willing to suffer and die for their belief. They were actively persecuted. The Tibetan monk. The Tibetan monks, they're not being persecuted for their beliefs or whatever. And in fact, they're being celebrated. They would have a motive to make up claims of rainbow bodies. So the evidence is night and day. Does that make sense in terms of the rainbow bodies?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, cool. So, okay, well, great. So we looked at 8 skeptical theories, and so far the resurrection skeptics have failed every single time. They haven't come up with an explanation. So what is the explanation of those 9 historical facts that I proved to you guys in week 3? Here's where we come to the Christian resurrection hypothesis. And this is the theory that, as the Bible says, God supernaturally raised Jesus from the dead. And when he left the tomb, he appeared to various people for a 40-day period, plus the Apostle Paul some years later. and he ascended into heaven. That's
Yes.
the resurrection hypothesis. So how does this do in terms of explaining all of the facts? Well, in terms of plausibility, I think it's totally plausible. Some skeptics have argued, well, the resurrection hypothesis is implausible because, look, there have been billions of human beings who have died and none of them rise from the dead. So, therefore, in terms of the plausibility, our background knowledge based on experience is that no, it's very improbable that God would raise Jesus from the dead because he didn't raise my brother, he didn't raise my grandfather. Out of all the human beings, there's like a 1 out of 2 billion chance that he would raise Jesus. But this kind of statistical game is really foolish because we're not just saying what the hypothesis is saying. The resurrection hypothesis is not saying what are the odds that God would just randomly raise Jesus arbitrarily for no reason at all. No, Jesus was a special case. God
Yes. Amen. Special.
Amen.
Born to die.
Yes.
Exactly. He had to atone for our sins. So God had a sufficient religious motivation for raising Jesus in particular from the dead. It's an entirely different question.
Yep.
So the skeptics are off base there. It's based on a
Yeah. Crazy.
Yeah, totally agree. And furthermore, the biblical records, there are biblical records of other people rising from the dead, right? Now, there is a difference in that Jesus is the first fruits. He's the only one who is actually resurrected proper. But we have examples of supernatural resuscitations. We have Lazarus, Tabitha in the Old Testament as well. So
the Old Testament, yeah.
Exactly. So the skeptics are kind of making this ad hoc assumption that, oh, there's only one case of somebody dying and then coming back to life, when actually you can't assume that because there are potentially examples. And on that front, I will raise Dr. Craig Keener because he's done a lot of research. He's written a 2-volume book on modern day miracles and miracle healings. And he documents some modern cases within Christianity of people being resuscitated from the dead when people pray in Jesus' name and stuff like that. So that depends, again, on your theology, if you're a cessationist or if you believe miracles continue to happen today. But yeah, some scholars claim that there are even cases of people raising from the dead supernaturally even today in the modern world. Yeah, and in terms of explanatory scope, this theory accounts for all 9 of the facts, right? It accounts for the claim of the bodily resurrection. It accounts for the empty tomb, because, yep, if Jesus rose bodily from the dead, then the body would be gone from the tomb. It accounts for the fact that Jesus died on the cross. Yep, because a resurrection requires that you die first in order to rise from the dead. It accounts for all of the resurrection appearances to the women, to the 500, to the 12 disciples at once, to the Apostle Paul, and to the James, the brother of Jesus. So it accounts for all that. And it also accounts for, because God raised Jesus from the dead for religious reasons, that can account for the disciples' transformed lives. Because Jesus, he wasn't just a random person. He was someone that was in a religious context. He had a religious message. And the resurrection served as divine authentication of Jesus's claims. It was essentially God saying, here's my stamp of approval. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus, it's true that his death, he died and rose for your sins. It's true. He is God in the flesh. So it accounts for all the facts. And it does so very well without any strain or vagueness or anything like that. Finally, in terms of simplicity, skeptics will say, well, the resurrection hypothesis isn't really simple because, again, it's assuming a supernatural act of God has taken place. But they'll say, but that's totally ad hoc because there's no proof that God exists or something like that. But contrary to what these skeptics claim, like I said, we have very powerful evidence for God's existence. And I think you guys have taken a course with Dr. Tony Costa where he outlines some of the arguments, like the cosmological argument, the argument from the fine tuning of the universe, the moral argument, things like that. So, yeah, scholars, there's like, I think there's hundreds, literally hundreds of arguments, all proving that God exists. So, yeah, the skeptic's just out to lunch on this claim. And on that front, it passes all the criteria. So you can see here are all the hypotheses we looked at today. I was trying to be generous to the skeptic. So the illusion and the hallucinations are utter failures. The objective visions, I gave it a green check mark for simplicity. It is a simple theory. And I gave it a questionable status as to whether it at least attempts to account for all 9 of the facts. But in doing so, I think it doesn't explain those facts well. So it gets a failure on explanatory power. And we also saw that it was totally implausible. The rainbow bodies, kind of similar. It fails on all accounts. But I was generous and gave it a question mark in terms of explanatory scope, even though I really think it's a failure, because a rainbow body wouldn't explain the appearances, right? Because the body is it's gone. It's rainbow light. So, whereas with the resurrection hypothesis, green check marks on all 4. So it's clear the resurrection hypothesis is clearly the best explanation we have for all 9 of the facts that we learned about in week 3. And yeah, that's it for today's lecture. For our next week, our last week in week 6, we're going to be looking at 4 objections and refuting the resurrection skeptic. So essentially what we've done here, we've laid out the positive case for the resurrection, right? We've said in week 1, what is the resurrection? What does that mean? Is it a bodily resurrection or some kind of spiritual thing? In week 2, we looked at evaluating what are the historical sources that we need to use to prove the resurrection. In week 3, we established what are the 9 historical facts that we can glean from those sources. And then in the last 2 weeks, we looked at what are the explanations and what is the best hypothesis out there to explain those facts. And as we just saw today, that's clearly the resurrection hypothesis. But what do the skeptics, do they have any negative evidence? And we're going to be looking at 4 objections resurrection skeptics raise against the resurrection, and we'll be refuting that. So that's the plan for next week. Yeah. Thank you guys.
All right. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you. Good night, Pastor.
Yeah, good night, guys.
Pastor, how are you feeling?
I am much better, much better.
Good. How's the family?
Yeah, family is good. I came back to life around Friday, Saturday. So.
Oh, that's great.
You were dead?
That's great.
Yeah, I was dead. Sister King, since Sister King asked if I was dead, I'm going to ask Sister King to close the prayer.
You didn't get a rainbow body, so that's all.
No, I didn't. I'm waiting for the resurrected body, but not the rainbow body.
Resurrection.
Yeah. So I will be sending you guys the PowerPoint from last week, and when they'll send me the PowerPoint from this week, I'll send them both to you. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.